Greetings and hello to all of you as we continue our series, Why Can't We Be Friends? A look at regions of the world where adjoining countries, adjacent countries, sometimes very long in existence, have demonstrated a terminal incompatibility, an inability to get along with each other. These regions are becoming more important these days as we recognize that we perhaps are on the cusp of a new type of a Cold War, one between ourselves, the United States, and China, something that we're going to look at in lectures later this year. But recognizing that China is a country that has vast ambitions to become a co-equal power to that of the United States. In matters of economic and manufacturing, China's already there. It has a fast-growing military and a much more proficient corps of military officers. It's beginning to be very adept in the use of soft power, the use of foreign aid, and the building of infrastructure in the developing world. This worldwide distribution of the Sinovac, its vaccine created to deal with COVID, and has ambitions to project its power not just in its part of the world, but worldwide. And we recognize, just like in the original Cold War, that whenever ourselves and China find ourselves on opposite sides of these regional disputes, the possibility of a much more enhanced conflict becomes more challenging and perhaps more dangerous for the rest of the world. Last month, just for example, we looked at the Korean Peninsula and recognized that in 1945, with the defeat of the Japanese, the Korean people were liberated from what had been 35 brutal years of Japanese occupation. But because Korea was liberated in the north by the Soviet Union and to the south by the United States, almost immediately the Korean people became divided in what were originally two temporary occupation zones to more formally in 1948, two separate states, North and South Korea. They went to war for 3 years, and when the conflict ended in the summer of 1953, we would see this one nation of people, Koreans, speaking their own language, their own alphabet, their own culture, their own history, for the next 68 years until the present time, grow to completely opposite directions in completely opposite different states. North Korea, significantly backed by only one country these days, China, and the United States, of course, having committed to defend the sovereignty of South Korea ever since the Korean conflict ended. And again, creating a lot of possibility of greater rancor and hostility, because now the two great world superpowers are on opposite sides of these adversaries. Today, we're going to stay in Asia, but move our attention southward to examine an event that occurred at the stroke of midnight on August 15th, 1947, and that was the partitioning of what had been the great British crown jewel of its empire, its India colony, into two states that were born on that August day in 1947, India and Pakistan. We're going to see how in the years following this partitioning, Pakistan would undergo some geographic changes as what was originally a divided Pakistan, West Pakistan, the Pakistan that we all know and love today, and East Pakistan, a region that in 1971 would win its independence from the Pakistani state to become Bangladesh, were created with 1,000 miles of the state of India located between these two halves of Pakistan. We recognize today that when we look at this region of the world, oftentimes referred to as the Indian subcontinent, this word subcontinent has a couple of different meanings depending on what perspective we use it. Geologists refer to the Indian subcontinent as what was once a floating tectonic plate, the India plate, that about 50 million years ago landed itself on the southern edge of Asia, near to where the Himalaya mountains are located today. So from geological purposes, the India subcontinent recognizes this tectonic mass on the southern part of Asia. For geopolitical purposes, whenever the term Indian subcontinent is used, it generally refers to, again, these two states, India and Pakistan, that until 1947 were part of the very vast British Empire. Now, today, the state of India has a population of just a bit under 1.4 billion people, making it the second most populous nation in the world today. India is projected in 5 years or so, by 2026, to overtake China to become the most populous country in the world. Maybe that's one of the reasons why recently the Chinese Communist Party increased its family size from a 2-child per family to a 3-child per family maximum. India is gaining ground on China. Pakistan, with a population of about 220 million, is the 5th most populous country in the world. And with a fast-growing population in Bangladesh, currently its population is around 160 million. Bangladesh is the 8th most populous country, but with a very high birth rate, is going to be probably rising higher into the ranks of populated countries worldwide every year. So we look at this one region of the world, the Indian subcontinent, and recognize that it contains a combined population of about 1.7 billion people. In a world with a population roughly at 7 billion, the subcontinent possesses nearly a quarter of all people living around the world today. And until 1947, all of that land was part, again, of this very rich British India colony. Now, since 1947, many of you know, of course, that Pakistan and India have become very adversarial towards each other, in large part because the manner in which colonial British India was divided was on the basis of religion, always a potentially troubling and a divisive way in which to partition any territory. And we know that in the year and at the time of partition, in August of 1947, Pakistan and India waged its first war between themselves, another one in 1965, another war in 1971, and then a final conflict between the two in 1999, the year after both India and Pakistan successfully tested their first nuclear weapons. So 23 years later, in 2021, India and Pakistan have significant arsenals of nuclear weapons, mostly pointed at each other, to go along with, again, these very prickly relations that exist between India, designed to be the state where the majority Hindu population in British colonial India could find a homeland, and Pakistan, a state where the very large, numerically, but minority Muslim population on the Indian subcontinent could find a home where Islam would be the majority faith. Now, how in the world did a tiny country, relatively speaking, like the United Kingdom, like Great Britain, manage to gain control over a large, vast, abundant colony like India? It requires us, of course, to go back to the time when Western European countries, Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, the Dutch, had established the ability to send fleets of ships all around the world. At the time, looking for new lands to plant the flag of the monarch who had sent that fleet on its journey, looking for new types of crops or jewels or any types of goodies that could be expropriated from these colonized lands and typically brought back to the country that had colonized it, and recognized that by the middle of the 18th century, by the middle of the 1700s, Britain had expanded such a number of its colonial possessions that it was said at the time that the sun never set on the British Empire. And in fact, if we were very quickly and cursorily to look from Britain and move eastward, we would recognize that during this period of time, the British came to control large parts of the continent of Africa, a large swath running from North Africa clear down to South Africa. The British over time would control the affairs of large parts of the Middle East. Places like Sudan, Egypt, Persia were at times very much intermingled with British colonial aspirations. The British would control, of course, the entirety of its India colony, parts of China, various islands in the Pacific, and then, of course, in the Americas, Britain at one time controlled its vast Canada colony, its 13 American colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, a couple of smaller colonies in South America, and several islands in the Caribbean and Atlantic Oceans, making its way, of course, back to Great Britain, a worldwide sphere of influence. The British became very adept at managing their colonies all around the world. And by the middle of the 18th century, by the middle of the 1700s, had established a worldwide mercantile system of commerce, where from some of its colonies, raw materials were extracted and often transported by a very vast network of merchant vessels to Great Britain or other parts of the British colonized world, where raw materials would become finished products of various types. For example, cotton and silk extracted from British colonial India would in other parts of the British world be manufactured into clothing, which would then be distributed throughout the British colonized world to be sold as finished products. So India would become a vast, stupendous repository of raw materials that the British again would very adroitly expropriate in a system it had designed to manage a colony as large and vast and highly populated as India would become. The British history with the India colony dates back to the very early days of the era of exploration and colonization. And in fact, it was a British private corporation of sorts, the British East India Company, that in 1608 would begin to establish a presence along the western coast of the Indian subcontinent. If you're looking at your map, it is the part of India that sits on the Arabian Sea, a stone's throw from Iran, a stone's throw from the Strait of Hormuz, the opening from the Indian Ocean into the Persian Gulf. Over time, the British East India Company would send explorers deeper and deeper into colonial India and come to recognize the vastness of raw materials that India could offer. Cotton, silk, tea, indigo dye, opium, jewels of various kinds that eventually would come into the possession of the British government proper, so that by 1700, much of the operations of the British East India Company would be overtaken by the control of the British government itself. So the question we must ask is, how in the world, again, did a small country like Great Britain, with, relatively speaking, a very small population, manage to take control of a colony like India, one that probably by the 1750s and approaching 1800 had to have a population in excess of 100 million people living in it? And how in the world did the British manage to create a workforce that would do the heavy physical labor in planting and sowing cotton, producing silk, mining for precious jewels, packaging and refining for export tea and opium? And the answer is by the creation of an entity that came to be known as the British Raj, R-A-J. The best definition I've found to describe the British Raj is one that I am going to now read. That implausible Byzantine structure of British military officers, district commissioners, magistrates, tax collectors, irrigation engineers, police inspectors, tribal agents, and other officials who, alongside tens of thousands of Indian colleagues, administered the vast subcontinent. The Raj represented, numbers-wise, a very, very tiny strata of all those who would reside on the India colony. But in a very adroit way, the British managed to create partnerships with powerful indigenous Indian monarchs of one kind or another. By the time Britain was ready to partition its India colony in 1947, colonial India had been divided into 565 princely states, as they were known. Places sometimes that were very large, like the Punjab, or like Bengal, or Gujarat, or Hyderabad, but some princely states that were really and truly just 100 or so square miles wide. Each of these princely states was led by a prince or a raja or a maharaja, some hereditary monarch to whom his or her subjects paid fealty and loyalty to. So through this great patchwork of kingdom after kingdom after kingdom, the British Raj found ways to incentivize the men and women who ruled over these princely states to make their populations productive, to organize their population to become the labor force, the workforce that would do the hard work of finding, taking, and packing all of these raw materials for transportation. The princely states and their leaders collecting what today we might call a piece of the action from the British Raj for their role in organizing and working their populations, their labor forces. So the British again would establish this same type of system in colonies in Africa, in colonies of the Middle East, where there again would be a token British presence, and the British would work these colonies like they did in India as something they viewed as an economic enterprise, something that wasn't necessarily going to be Anglicanized by the British, but instead was going to be utilized for the raw materials that these colonies produced. So just as an aside, we recognize how the British colonial experience in America was quite different than really what was the norm throughout the British colonized world. By 1700, Britain had come to control 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard of the United States from New Hampshire to Georgia. And by this time, the British had found a way to induce the indigenous populations in America, which confusingly for our topic were referred to as Indians, to either pick up and move inland through war, through treaty, or through purchase. So we would watch the British colonies in America be very rapidly populated by immigrants leaving Great Britain to become farmers, fishermen, timbermen in Britain's colonies in America. This immigrant population, of course, supplemented by a large, growing population of African slaves and their descendants, who would do a lot of the labor-intensive work in the rural southern states in America. So we would see the British colonies in America evolve as colonies, of course, where English was the spoken language, where the dominant religions were Western European Christian religions, where British law, British customs, British traditions, British literature became the norm and the curriculum for young students in these colonies, as these American colonies really evolved to be very British and in some cases microcosms of what those immigrants who settled in America had left behind in Britain before. Now, India would evolve as a totally different experiment and more the norm in the British colonized world. Long before the British arrived, Hinduism had evolved to become the dominant religion on the Indian subcontinent. And the British, of course, would find a very large existing Hindu population when they began to arrive in the early 17th century. In addition to Hinduism and religions that would evolve sort of as offshoots of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Zoroastrianism, Islam would find its way to the Indian subcontinent in the centuries following the revelation of the Islamic faith to Muhammad on the middle of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. Practitioners of Islam believe that God revealed the Islamic faith to his disciple Muhammad. And in the centuries following Muhammad's death, we would see large Arab armies rise from the Arabian Peninsula and begin the process of exporting and Islamizing places outside of the peninsula to the west, overrunning and Islamizing Egypt, Islamizing Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, and we know for more than a century, establishing a presence in what is today Western Spain and parts of Portugal, a very significant movement of this faith westward through Africa and into Europe. At the same time, we would see Islam exported to the East. By the 8th century, by the 9th century, Persia would be Islamized. Then would come these peoples living in Southern Asia. Today, their homelands end with the suffix "stand," meaning land of, so that what are today Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan were Islamized as the faith began to make its way further and further to the east. By the year 1000, Islam would establish its presence on the Indian subcontinent. Given the nature of Islam, we would see that its arrival on the Indian subcontinent would coincide with the destruction of many ancient Hindu monuments, temples, Islam believing that these were idolatrous because they worshiped something other than God himself. So the fact remains that when the British arrived, the subcontinent was already teeming with several different large religious communities, Hinduism being the largest, Islam being the second largest, and significant Buddhist and Sikh populations. Sikhism, a religion, one of the youngest, I guess, in significant religions worldwide, that evolved right around the 16th century and found a very large presence in what was the Punjab region of the Indian subcontinent. So as the British began to construct this Raj, this way in conjunction with leaders of the princely states to work the colony to produce raw materials, they did so not seeking to Christianize much of the population of the subcontinent and permitting these religions to coexist peacefully for the most part. The irony of what we're going to talk about by the time we get to 1947 and the partitioning of British India and the great spasm of sectarian violence that would immediately begin between the Hindu and Muslim populations in the subcontinent is that for centuries before, for the most part, Buddhists and Hindu and Sikh and Muslims had lived, in some cases, with each other, adjacent to each other, and for the most part had coexisted peacefully. Remarkably, given the great differences that exist between Islam and Hinduism, the two primary faiths in the area. Islam, along with Christianity and Judaism, is considered one of the world's three great monotheistic Abrahamic religions. Muslims, Christians, Jews believing that Abraham is a common father, a common ancestor to each of these three faiths that worship just one God. Hinduism is a polytheistic faith in which broadly a number of gods are worshipped for different purposes, and more closely, numbers of regional gods and goddesses were worshipped along the Indian subcontinent as well. Islam is a faith, like Christianity and Judaism, that believes all people are created equal in the eyes of God, while Hinduism is a faith predicated on the fact that people are not born equal. And in fact, people are born into different castes or different strata of Hindu society, from Brahmin to warrior to merchant to laborer, the lowest Dalit class. It is very much a function of Hinduism to view their society as one that is unequal. One of the foundations of Hinduism is a belief that human desire is the root of all evil, and striving to control human desire, to tame it, to eradicate it, is the goal of devout Hindus, because once human desire is eradicated, an individual can reach a state of nirvana, the highest level. Because Hinduism is a faith that believes that life is a cycle of birth and death and rebirth, reincarnation, how one lives a previous life is going to determine which caste or strata of life they are going to live in the future. One's karma from a previous life will inform how one lives a subsequent life. So no pretense that everyone is born equal. Islam is a faith that very much seeks to convert, sometimes famously, forced conversions were very much part and parcel with the spread of Islam east and west following the creation of the faith. And even at modern times, stories of forced conversions to Islam are part of the nature of that faith today. Hinduism, on the other hand, was a more absorptive faith, meaning that Hindus as a people did not resist other faiths being built upon parts of the fundamental tenets of Hinduism. Buddhism, for instance, is a religion that did in fact evolve from Hinduism. Buddhists believe that nirvana is more of a Christian-like heaven than the places where people evolve into in subsequent lives. Islam is a faith that is practiced quietly in prayer, in mosque. Hinduism, a religion where singing and music is very much emanating as worship takes place in a temple. Muslims don't eat pork. Hindus don't eat beef, and in fact view cows as being sacred. So these pretty significantly different faiths nonetheless coexisted for most of the time during the British Raj, the British colonization of India. And for the most part, the British tolerated and permitted these faiths to continue to practice as they did, provided there were no extremes, no actions that perhaps offended the sensibilities of the British, or perhaps offended the sensibilities of British Christians. So the caste system was very much permitted to continue and exist all the way really until the present time, but certainly through the colonial period, while other practices viewed as more extreme were curtailed by the British. One such practice, suttee, S-U-T-T-E-E, the practice where a widow begins the act of self-immolation by jumping on the funeral pyre of her deceased husband, very much offended British sensibilities, and that practice was curtailed. Another practice known as thuggee, T-H-U-G-E-E. The word thug comes from this practice, was one where travelers on certain mountainous areas were waylaid and sacrificed to the goddess Kali. The British weren't very wild about this practice, and it was curtailed, again, as part of the operation of the British Raj and the relatively light hand it placed on religious practice. So earlier, when we defined the Raj, we described it as, again, a very thin strata of the British working with tens of thousands of indigenous Indians to make this colony as productive as possible. So the British established throughout its India colony a very modern system of schools to provide primary educations to lots of the population of the subcontinent, and to give the British an opportunity to evaluate those who were bright students, those who might be sent to Great Britain in order to be trained as doctors and lawyers and engineers so that they could return home, live pretty good lives, and become a very important part of the means by which the British ran this vast colony. So through the years, tens of thousands of Indians would be sent to Britain and some in other parts of Europe in order to become the professionals that would then return home to practice. And we would see, of course, that this would become sort of the double-edged sword that often had to be managed by countries that had to expose part of a colonized population or part of the population in an authoritarian country to Western-style democracy, majority rule, and the Western concept of broad individual liberties that all citizens should enjoy. So the phenomenon of young people, bright people, living in the West, feeling the freedoms and the liberties of the West, probably for the first time being exposed to democratization, being exposed to majority rule, and then returning home to recognize that none of these rights, and certainly the right of self-government, has never existed among their people, was almost certainly eventually going to cause some of these best and the brightest in India to begin some movement to achieve self-government, an articulation of individual rights, independence, and majority rule. So looking back on the colonial experience, not just in India, but all around the world, if one were going to try to defend a period in which some undeveloped region was benefited by a European country coming and colonizing it, we might look at the India colony and recognize pros and cons. The cons, of course, were that individual citizens were exploited and oftentimes compelled to perform vast amounts of manual labor for little, none, or very little compensation. We would see that the areas in question would often unnaturally and very rapidly be harvested for whatever goods. In the case of India, be it cotton or silk or sugar or salt or tea or jewels that might be mined there. And overwhelmingly, these goods would be expropriated. They would be taken away from these lands to be utilized, sold elsewhere. Now, the British, during their time in India, did do some things that, in retrospect, might be beneficial for an eventual independent Indian subcolony. It created a system of education that was the most first-rate educational system that during the colonial period existed just about anywhere in Asia. The British established a rather enviable system of hospitals and the availability to see doctors, things that, again, in developing parts of Asia today, even in parts of India and Pakistan, don't exist perhaps as well run as they did during the British colonial period. The British established a system of ports, very large vessels able to dock and take goods to India and take goods away from India. Eventually, a system of roads, a system of railroads, a postal system, a colony-wide telegraph and then telephone system. Things that simply did not exist comprehensively in other parts of colonized Asia. So the turning point or the beginning of the turning point, I guess, towards Indian independence would occur in the latter part of the 19th century, the late 1800s, as groups of Western educated, for the most part, Indians began to aspire towards independence, towards self-government. In 1869, an organization calling itself the Indian National Congress would be formed. It would be known as the Congress, that had as its goal the independence and self-determination for the whole, the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, of the British colonized India. Through the early parts of the 20th century, 1900 to 1910, 1910 to 1920, membership in the Indian National Congress grew, but the ability to persuade the British House of Commons, the British House of Lords, the British people, the British nobility, that it was time to let colonial India go on its way, had not achieved quite a bit. Letters to the editor of British newspapers, correspondence with some progressive British minds towards decolonization, attempts to stir Britain's former colonies that had found their way to independence, America, Canada, Australia, again, not successful. Around 1920, we would see a synergy of events come about to put India on suddenly a very rapid path towards independence. For one, 1920 would be the year where new, great, evolving technologies for the time would begin to be more universally present in the British-occupied world. In 1922, for instance, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, would be established, and soon the BBC would have a presence in every significant part of the British colonized world, so that their correspondents could broadcast to a large audience, members of the British Empire, members of the British Commonwealth, former British colonies, news happening from all around the world, but specifically from all around the British realm throughout the world. By the early 1920s, through the magic of motion pictures, newsreels would be able to capture images of events taking place, moving images that could then be broadcast all around the world, certainly all around the British Empire, in theaters, week after week, month after month. So these more rapid and more comprehensive forms of communication would set the stage for an individual to emerge who would certainly become the symbolic presence of Indian resistance to continued British governance and a desire for India to seek its independence. And the person in question was a man born in the Indian province of Gujarat in 1869, named, of course, Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi, as a young boy, was recognized again as someone who was bright, who could and should be educated, one of these who should be exposed to British law and British governance. So Gandhi would spend time in London, would be educated as an attorney, eventually become a barrister, a trial attorney, and, don the wig and the top hat and the striped pants and the suit of an English British barrister. Gandhi would spend 20 years living in Durban, in British South Africa at the time, from around 1895 to 1915. Arriving in South Africa again as a British-trained lawyer, Gandhi, as a man of Indian descent with rather dark complexion, was not permitted to enjoy the full pleasures of life in South Africa that an educated man of his talent should, because Gandhi was considered colored under the very repressive apartheid system that had evolved in South Africa. Gandhi would spend the latter part of his time in South Africa attempting to raise consciousness in South Africa and other parts of the British world to the unfairness of apartheid. But around 1915, perhaps frustrated, perhaps homesick, Gandhi would return to India. He would join the Indian National Congress, and then he would determine that he was going to symbolize the plight of the lowest rung Hindu living under India's caste system. He did away with the top hats and the fancy clothes and began to wear the loincloth, the simple, spare garment that those in the lowest untouchable class in Hindu society wore. And Gandhi would begin to practice something he called ahimsa, nonviolent, non-cooperation, nonviolent civil disobedience, ahimsa, a way that Gandhi believed would enable journalists and photographers and anyone with a set of ears and eyes and common sense to recognize the brutality of the dominant British colonial presence against someone like himself and those who would emulate him, peacefully resisting continued British governance. So through the 1920s, the 1930s, and into the 1940s, this little man who eventually, who by the time actually was referred to by the honorific title Mahatma, great soul, became a symbol of Indian resistance to continued British occupation. Gandhi would be arrested dozens of times and incarcerated for, again, acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. He would at times engage in hunger strikes that all of a sudden, covered by radio, covered by newspapers, chronicled in newsreels, would pressure the British Raj to often relent or engage in talks in one area or another. In 1930, to oppose a rise in the tax on salt the British produced in India, Gandhi would engage in a nearly 200-mile march from interior India to the sea. Those who have seen the movie Gandhi probably remember that soon Gandhi was joined by hundreds and then thousands of fellow Indians marching to the sea in order to very simply make their own salt, in which the British taxman did not receive a cut. Long ago, Gandhi had taken to the practice of spinning his own thread and making his own clothing. Again, not to have to pay the British tax collector for the cost of threads and materials made from Indian raw products. By the 1930s, as the British began to discuss the propriety of maintaining colonies around the world between the two world wars, as countries like the United States and Canada and some leaders in Australia began to speak out against British colonialism, and in particular against the mistreatment of nonviolent, peaceful protesters like Gandhi, we would see the British House of Commons begin to respond to, again, these more prominent displays of resistance. The Conservative Party, one of the dominant parties in Britain at the time, if not the dominant party, was one that would try all the way until 1947 to prevent the setting free of the India colony. During the 1920s and certainly the 30s and the 40s, Winston Churchill would probably be the most prominent conservative in the House of Commons. We know that Churchill detested Gandhi and very much viewed him and his actions as a threat in the court of public opinion to continued British maintenance of its colonial empire in India. We know that in the late 1930s, letters were exchanged viewing Gandhi as such a risk that perhaps it would be appropriate for him to be arrested, tried for treason, and maybe even executed for treasonous behavior. Imagine this, executing, Gandhi. Now, by the 1930s, however, we would see this one united movement, the India Congress Party, begin to split, begin to fracture, because it is a fact that up until the 1920s, the Indian National Congress had been a non-sectarian movement with large numbers of Hindus and significant numbers of Muslims, mostly, again, well-educated, mostly professionals, united in this goal to bring about a separate and independent single India. By the 1920s, however, it became clear to some Muslim members of the Indian National Congress that if, in fact, India were to win its independence, and if, in fact, India was to be a country that governed itself, where majority ruled, India's Muslim population would be numerically a constant second-class population, perhaps destined to the whims of the majority Hindu population on the subcontinent. So by the mid-1920s, an organization that had the same goal, Indian independence, but perhaps a different way to achieve it, called the Muslim League, had found a leader in a man called Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Jinnah, or Jinnah. Jinnah, who came to be known as the Quaid al-Azam, the leader of the land, took up the mantle of the Muslim League, and by the 1930s was actively advocating Indian independence that would be coupled with the partitioning of the India colony so that a separate majority Muslim country might emerge. One that Jinnah spoke very hopefully and optimistically of as a so-called Pakistan, in Urdu meaning land of the pure. Now, by the 1930s, another important player would arrive on the scene, pushing for Indian independence. In this case, a Hindu from Gujarat province by the name of Jawaharlal Nehru. Jawaharlal Nehru would soon become himself again a well-educated, British-educated lawyer, the managerial force, the operational force behind the Indian National Congress. Gandhi, as this overall symbol of Indian independence. Jinnah, again, now suddenly advocating independence and partition, the creation of a Muslim state, while Nehru and Gandhi as well aspired to one single, whole, united India being created. So 1939 comes along, and of course, in September of that year, Britain becomes a participant in the Second World War. Like the British had done in the past, it asked, and in some cases expected, its former colonial areas, places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, to contribute troops to the British side, as they had done in World War I and as they had done in previous regional conflicts. Britain certainly expected India, a very highly populated area, perhaps in excess of 400 million people living on the subcontinent to do like it had done in the past. Send troops, send these very efficient Sikh warriors to fight on behalf of the mother country to win this conflict. Now, in 1940, Gandhi and Nehru adopted for the Indian National Congress a so-called Quit India policy, where they actively encouraged young Indian men to not take up the fight to defend the country that continued to colonize and expropriate raw materials from it. As a result, Nehru would be incarcerated for nearly 3 years during the Second World War, kept away from reporters, kept away from microphones, kept away from newspapermen. And Gandhi would be forced to live within one of the palaces owned by the Raja of Hyderabad, one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time, Hyderabad having one of the largest diamond mining operations outside of South Africa. Gandhi sort of had to, live separated and incommunicado in one of the Raja's palaces. Jinnah, on the other hand, encouraged Muslim Indians to fight on behalf of the British, as they'd done in the past. And in reality, all of India would contribute, again, a large fighting force who would participate in the fighting in North Africa and then later in fighting in Asia. And of course, in May of 1945, Germany would surrender and the war in Europe would come to an end. So in July of 1945, the British set their first elections since before World War II began in 1939. Winston Churchill, campaigning on behalf of the majority Conservative Party, basically urging the British people to stick with the government that had seen it to victory in Europe. There was still a war in the Pacific that had to be won. While the opposing party, the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, ran on an entirely different platform. Attlee and the Labour ticket basically promised the British that now that the war has ended, it was time to look inward, and even though Attlee didn't say this, sort of he meant to build back Britain better. Lots of Britain had been destroyed during the Blitz and German bombing of the UK, but lots of British housing and infrastructure, hospitals and schools that existed were very old, very rundown, and very antiquated. Attlee promised that if the Labour government was elected, it would begin to plow resources into rebuilding Britain, schools, homes, hospitals, and the like. Attlee promised that if the Labour Party prevailed, it would create a national health service to provide to all British citizens health care free of charge. In 1947, the National Health Service was in fact created and exists all the way up until the present time. And also, Attlee promised that if the Labour government was elected, it would accelerate the decolonization of British possessions all around the world, starting with India. Attlee, from the perspective of the Labour government, viewing the costs in running and maintaining a hold on this vast subcontinent as being too high, given the fact that following the end of the Second World War, the British treasury was virtually empty. Britain was broke. So in these elections, in July of 1945, the Labour Party wins a majority in the House of Commons. Clement Attlee is selected to serve as the British Prime Minister. And the already underway task of decolonizing India, setting India free, independent, is accelerated. So in 1946, King George VI sends his cousin, another royal, World War II hero, Lord Louis Mountbatten. He had about 7 first names. We'll just stick with Louis for our purposes, to become the viceroy, ultimately India's last viceroy, who would oversee the partitioning of the Indian subcontinent into a state for the majority Hindu population and a state for the large but minority Muslim population. So by the summer of 1947, the maps of what would emerge from decolonization were already out. And in particular, the maps had to make some very significant partitioning of regions on the subcontinent where there were significant pockets of Muslim populations. To the west, in what would become and what is today Pakistan on your map, the large Punjab province was partitioned so that the western Punjab could be a large part of what was then created as West Pakistan. 1,000 miles across, what you see on your map now as Bangladesh was the eastern part of the Indian Bengali province, the Bengal province, a huge province, the eastern part of which had a majority Muslim population. So this eastern Bengal would become a significant part of what in 1947 would become East Pakistan. Now, as the date of partitioning drew closer, midnight, August 15th, 1947, there began 2 things. One, internal migrations. People who were Hindu or Sikh living in the Punjabi part of that province that would become West Pakistan began in some cases picking up, bringing what possessions they could in order to move to other parts of the subcontinent that would become India, the state for the Hindu and also the majority of the Sikh population. And similarly, we would see people leaving the eastern Bengal, the majority Muslim area that was going to be the hub of East Pakistan if they were Hindu, and again, moving to Hindu areas. On the other hand, in parts of what was going to become the very large state of India, we would see Muslims naturally, perhaps naturally, want to gravitate to either West Pakistan or East Pakistan, where they could live among their co-religionists as a majority population. Now, during these great movements where more than 20 million people transmigrated from one of these states to another, there soon was accompanied with it spasms of violence. In some cases, people that had lived peaceably among each other, near each other, with each other for centuries, suddenly recognized that because these two states were going to be created on the basis of religion, religion was suddenly going to be a very divisive element of statehood. Massacres of caravans of Muslims traveling to one of the two Pakistans soon began to make rounds, and soon the casualties and the numbers of murders and the numbers of rapes began to go up, some greatly exaggerated. Similarly, Hindus and Sikhs leaving the West, leaving Punjab to find their way into India, slaughtered, massacred, village wiped out, numbers exaggerated regarding the numbers of casualties, so that by the time partition arrived, August 15th, 1947, again, a huge spasm of murder and bloodletting was already underway. Railroad trains of cars carrying migrants from one area, from India to West Pakistan, say, was derailed, waylaid, the rail cars attacked. Oftentimes, when the trains finally were put back on their tracks and arrived at stations in West Pakistan, or if it had to do with Hindus and Sikhs leaving West Pakistan to India, trains pulling into Delhi, blood would literally be pouring out of the train cars as these train cars and train loads of bodies began to arrive. Millions killed in all probability, certainly millions injured, and again, a huge transmigration, relocation, the likes of which probably has never been seen in modern history, was underway. One area far to the north on the subcontinent, if you see Delhi on the map and go straight up to the border between India and China, lied the provinces of Kashmir and Jammu. A province where 75% of the population was Muslim, but a province that had as its Raja a Hindu, a man by the name of Hari Singh. So when the question of Kashmir and Jammu arose, and which country it was going to accede to, India or Pakistan, Hari Singh, the leader of Kashmir, attempted to hold out and assert independence, sovereignty. Neither Pakistani or Indian, we could get along with both. But soon, tribesmen from the northwest province of western Pakistan, highly devout Muslims, began massing on Pakistan's border with Kashmir as stories of Muslims in Kashmir being prosecuted or persecuted by the Hindu leader Hari Singh began to emerge. Hari Singh asked India to come to its aid, to protect it from an imminent attack. Nehru responded that India would do so only if Singh agreed that Kashmir and the adjoining state of Jammu would become part of India, which he did. And as the states of India and Pakistan were born, they went to war along the border between Pakistan and India at Kashmir. They would fight again over control of Kashmir in 1965, and then again later in the 1990s. This border still today between India and Pakistan, between Kashmir and Pakistan, still one of the most highly contested borders in the world. In 1970, in East Pakistan, again, two Pakistans separated by 1,000 miles of India, having only one thing in common: large numbers of practitioners of Islam, but nothing else. Different ethnic groups, Punjabi versus Bengali, different languages, different physical characteristics. East Pakistan, by 1970, had already grown and established a significant independence movement coming to be known as the Awami League. In 1970, East Pakistan would be struck by a cyclone that would take the lives of approximately 500,000 people, 500,000 people. It was called at the time a second Hiroshima. West Pakistan did not immediately send the amount of aid that East Pakistan thought it needed in the wake of this cyclone. The nationalistic Awami League very much stimulated resistance to a continued presence in Pakistan. And after a war fought from 1970 through 1971, a war in which India came to side with East Pakistan, seeking its independence, East Pakistan, by the end of 1971, would indeed win its independence, emerging as the separate, sovereign nation of Bangladesh. And today, of course, we see Bangladesh very rapidly growing and modernizing. We see India and Pakistan, of course, experiencing a very difficult wave of COVID. But we recognize that among the most militant, hot borders that exist anywhere in the world, the long nuclearized border between India and Pakistan is today one of the hottest anywhere in the world. So, as always, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to meeting again next month, where we are going to focus our attention on the Middle East in 2021, in the summer of 2021. Thank you, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.